Erik Sperling is Executive Director of Just Foreign Policy in Washington, D.C. He and his team work against rampant US interventionism, advocate a diplomatic approach to conflict resolution, and work to promote human rights. Sperling has keen interest in the issues related to South Asia and Middle East, and has worked with the American Pakistani community over the past 3 years, notably during her Donald Liu hearing and campaign for House Resolution 901 in 2024. Sperling, before joining Just Foreign Policy, has been a congressional staffer and has worked as senior advisor and counsel with Congressman Ro Khanna and John Conyers. He recently joined Moeed Pirzada, editor Global Village Space, to discuss the dynamics of relations between Pakistani army and Trump administration, new developing fault lines between Washington and Delhi, the growing role and importance of Pakistani community in Washington, and the challenges that lie ahead.
What is your understanding how the Pakistani military, found their entry with Donald Trump to begin with in January?
Pakistan in general, of course, they declared independence, but functionally, they're in sort of a neo-colonial relationship with the United States.
What kind of relationship United States has with India?
Well, India has such a unique history. I think they did truly develop true sovereignty. They are, in fact, a sovereign country, even though they do a lot of harmful things. I think the U.S., national security community knew that Imran Khan was absolutely a rock-solid guarantee of that true sovereignty. Effectively, military dictator Asim Munir came. He's showing Trump, here are minerals, you can have these, and just saying, what can we do? I even learned a new Pakistani phrase related to, well, it's kind of a offensive phrase. But, oh God, it's the one about lifting, that one. But they.
What are you talking about? This is earthquake. You think that the US establishment doesn't think that Pakistan is a strong credible Chinese ally?
But of course, if anyone studies this closely, there's no Pakistani corrupt generals retiring in Shanghai. They buy their property in the West. They're culturally tied to the West. If Imran Khan comes into power, he's not only the most powerful voice for Palestine, for Muslims, they're also worried about what would happen if he essentially indirectly or informally kind of join that Russia, China, Iran bloc.
What do you think the Pakistani community achieved and where it failed?
Those Americans who don't want the U.S. to be propping up a military regime, and those Pakistani Americans who are also fighting for their own freedom and that of their families. That's kind of the coalition between those two groups.
Erik, a very warm welcome on behalf of myself and my viewers on this channel. I'll come straight to the point. What was the vision and the purpose behind the creation of Just Foreign Policy?
Yeah, well, Just Foreign Policy was founded right after the Iraq War had been launched and after the Afghanistan invasion. And the idea was to prepare for what was expected then to be a forthcoming attack on Iran. That was something that the architects of the other two wars had talked about. And so it's quite amazing that, and the concept is to mobilize American people and work inside the U.S. government as well, bring that people power to the U.S. government and guide it and target it to try to push back a little bit against the very, very powerful military, what you call the military-industrial complex, or sort of the national security elites in Washington who are tend to be always pushing for war. So it's amazing. 20 years later, if you watch Fox News, CNN right now, it's all talking about a war with Iran. So it's incredible how some things never change, I guess.
So I'm surprised, I thought that Iran was actually cooperating with the United States and the allies in the invasion of Iraq. Was there a plan to attack Iran at that time?
Yeah, well, this is, if your viewers haven't seen it, it's one of the most important clips. General Wesley Clark was a very hawkish guy, but he's given a clip where he talks about his visit to the Pentagon.
Oh, yeah, I've seen that. About
this is
countries.
Everyone should look it up. It's 7 countries. If you look up Wesley Clark, 7 countries. And he said this repeatedly in multiple interviews. And they made very clear that they intended to use the 9/11 attacks as sort of a pretext to do what they had wanted to do, which is take out what they consider, hostile regimes or regimes that were aligned with, say, Russia and China before Russia, China would recover and rise and become a threat. And that was their idea. But it went pretty poorly in Iraq, and that sort of threw a wrench in their plans. Though if you look at those 7 countries, they've taken down almost every one of them one way or another. They couldn't do the invasion route, but they've found a way to take down most of them.
What are the 7 countries you think they have taken down? One is Iraq. The other is Syria. The third is
Yeah, now
Libya.
I'm gonna have to, there's so many. I'm gonna have to pull up the seven countries real quick, but definitely Syria.
Mhm.
I'll just pull it up very quickly here.
Libya, Syria, Libya, Iraq, three,
Yep, and then you had Lebanon,
Lebanon, four.
Libya,
Mhm.
Sudan,
Mhm.
Somalia, and
Mhm.
Iran.
Oh my
Ultimately,
God.
Iran.
So the
Yeah.
conflict is still going on.
And this conflict is still going on, but it's gotten a little more complicated. Ultimately, their analysis wasn't wrong in the sense that it has become more difficult to take down these countries when, with a very strong China. China has been able to continue doing trade with countries like Iran, and that's been essentially the sole lifeline for them. It was also true of Venezuela. So yeah, their theory was right. I think their goals were immoral
It's
and
very
was
interesting
ultimately bad
because
strategy.
I heard the statement from President Donald Trump day before yesterday that he's actually, or he's continuously saying this, that if we don't take Greenland, then Russia or China will take Greenland. So I think the same argument, the same thinking.
Yeah, and he's a more unique guy. We don't totally understand his thinking. I mean, I think he's very much attracted to the idea of expanding the map, having a big flag on a country that, according to that map projection, looks huge. But there is a lot of national security experts that do think correctly think there's a competition for the Arctic with Russia and China now.
Hmm.
But most sensible people, the American
Is there
people,
is
would
there a
say,
competition? Is there a real competition with Russia and China on Arctic?
well, there is, yeah, and there's it doesn't have to be such a competition. I think those of us who are more sensible would say resume the type of Arctic cooperation that was going on. It was
Hmm.
largely finally suspended more recently with the Ukraine invasion, but it's essentially there are two approaches on virtually every issue. One is to collaborate with
Hmm.
China
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
Russia,
Hmm.
try to lower tensions
Hmm.
and make the race less extreme. This also applies to say AI, where Russia, U.S., and China are racing on AI, and it could
Right.
pose dangers for the world because AI is somewhat unknown the impact it'll have. But the Arctic is the same way. I mean, if both sides are just racing to build ships and build bases, and then start exploiting resources up there, it's not only going to be a huge waste of money for everybody involved to have that arms race, but also could lead to environmental disaster as well. So I think Trump's right that there's a competition for that space, but the correct answer is promote diplomacy, have a sensible approach. So, but yeah, I think Trump is a little unique. I think he wants a legacy piece, and he likes how that looks on that map. But I think for others, it's a little bit more strategic. This is seen by the national security elite as very unstrategic because it alienates the NATO allies
Hmm.
that DC values so much.
So, but I let me come to a very basic and fundamental question. If you have a hyperpower like United States, which is not rival and constrained by another major power like Soviet Union till 1990s, how do you constrain and control the ambitions of such a hyperpower? I mean, look at Greenland. I mean, most Europeans have a very pusillanimous kind of attitude. I mean, even the European Union is not very clear. I mean, as to how to respond to Trump's grab for Greenland. I mean, how do you constrain such a hyperpower?
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple different ways. One of the ways is, of course, that the people that this type of approach does require, controlling and managing massive populations abroad. Pakistan is obviously a huge example of this, where the U.S. felt very comfortable with the ruling elites they were supporting. There was a system that they thought was working. We just switch, from this party to that party, and then back to this party with our military, U.S.-backed military firmly in control the whole time. And then ultimately what happens is someone, a leader will come along that connects with the people, that channels their points of view and channels their dreams and aspirations. And then the U.S.
You mean
turns the
Imran
handle.
Khan? You mean Imran Khan was
In
the
this case, I think it's pretty clear. I mean, this is one of the most probably one of the greatest case studies in the world in terms of a people that had really no way out, of this sort of, it's a system that was intended to look like a democracy. Of course, it's essentially a military dictatorship and sort of a kleptocracy with the military, controlling virtually all the major resources. So then Imran Khan, legendary sports figure, international, kind of cosmopolitan person, then he, channels that energy. And now we see it's not been that easy for the U.S. to stop that movement. They've done everything they can, and more. I mean, they've had to create new approaches because, that connection he has with the population is so strong that so that's one way it gets stopped, is that little by little people find their leader, he organizes, and the country is liberated and ultimately kind of
But
truly
Eric,
sovereign.
it's a very interesting. I mean, you refer to Imran Khan. Most Pakistanis, in their own common sense, would have thought that someone like Imran Khan, who's educated at Oxford, who lived 20 plus years in Britain, who was very comfortable with the Western elite, had interacted with them. When he talks to an American president or American Secretary of State, he basically puts, looks eye to eye. He's very comfortable, unlike Nawaz Sharif, Shahbaz Sharif, the Pakistani army generals. So Western ruling elite and the power elite will like to connect with a man like this, that who can bring along the popular support to the Western agenda. They will try to convince him that, look, these are our strategic interests in South Asia or the West Asia. Why it is not happening this way? Why they have to remove him? Why they have to go after him? Why they have to put him in jail?
Yeah, well, one reason is that they got very comfortable with a very pliant regime, and so they have a very low tolerance for an independent-minded Pakistan. I think obviously, any of Imran Khan's positions, you look at him, I mean, he thought the drone war was counterproductive and a human rights violation. I mean, that's a completely moderate position. He has issues with the military controlling the economy, reducing corruption. These are not even slightly radical positions. These are kind of common sense, basic viewpoints that are surely shared by any normal person. So, so you'd think that he would, they would respect that, but they're used to a regime that has no independent thought, and so that's the first reason why. When they can have that, they definitely prefer that, and they'll work to maintain that. Even if it's unreasonable, and the system is set up that they can't think of long-term goals. Like obviously, I think everyone in this community knows that it would be better to build that connection with Imran Khan. And that will form a healthy bond with between the American and Pakistani peoples that would be enduring. But instead, the short-term nature of the system, the kind of the all or nothing thinking of the U.S. system, makes it where it's not even able to consider that they might be alienating Pakistan long term.
So, but there is a puzzle. Imran Khan struck a good note with Donald Trump in the first presidency, perhaps because of Afghanistan. When he came here, he was very warmly embraced and welcomed in 2019. And afterwards, he was having communication, correspondence. Trump also appreciated him once or twice, not like the way he appreciated the Field Marshal Asim Munir, but he did mention him as a good man, as someone he can work with, or he's working with him. He appreciated him. What went wrong with the Biden presidency in January 2021 that Biden never, even received a congratulation call from Imran Khan? Was it Biden? Was it the Central Intelligence Agency? Was it the deep state? What happened?
Yeah, and what we call the deep state, that's been used many different ways, but it's really just the national security elites. In our country, it's really generally not a democratic process. So when we say, so yes, there is a national security elite, and it's both in government, it's in the think tanks, and then of course, yeah, in government, also in the intelligence agencies and so on. And so, yeah, I would say that, what happened there is essentially that, the Biden administration is very much comprised of people who are in that national security establishment. And those people are all well educated that, Pakistan under the military, effective military rule, is the ideal situation for the US as long as it can be maintained, and so once Ukraine happened and there was
No, but Ukraine happened. No. But Eric, this is what the confusion is. Ukraine happened in the beginning of 2022. Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022. In January, on 20th January 2021, when President Biden came into White House, that was Afghanistan withdrawal time. Ukraine was not necessarily on the horizon. Imran Khan had good communication with the outgoing president, Donald Trump. Suddenly, the leaders in a normal ritual called the US president for congratulation. Imran Khan kept on trying to place a call, a 5-minute, 10-minute call to president. His call was not welcomed. He was simply banished from the American foreign policy from 20th January onward. I still don't understand what really happened.
Yeah, well, to be clear, ever since Imran Khan was a leading voice on those drone strikes, I mean, I know I was a young man in college, in college, and that's when I'd first heard of him, because we were protesting, that drone war too, just eliminating families from the air, on a suspicion. We had issue with that back then, and he did too. So the U.S. never forgot that. That's the kind of, it was a very potent criticism.
U.S. never forgot that. You mean like Biden was personally invested into the issue? He was foreign policy person.
Yeah, well, certainly that. Yeah, I mean, the Obama administration was extremely active when it came to drone strikes. That was perhaps, one of Obama's, most problematic actions. There's quite a few, but that was, up there in terms of some of the worst things he did. So it's not just that, it's not Biden personally. Biden is very much, he was the chair of Senate Foreign Relations. He was very embedded in the national security grand strategy game. He always was, even right to his last days. And many people would say it was sort of his undoing in the sense that, even he admitted it, that he's focusing too much on foreign policy. And why is that? I think when people get a little older, people, maybe your viewers have someone who's older, they tend to kind of shift towards those things they know really well. And so all that to say is Biden knows foreign policy well, and it's exactly the establishment foreign policy, that bipartisan consensus that, where you have Lindsey Graham on the hawkish side of that consensus, and you'd have, a number of Democrats. I guess I won't name them, but you have a number of, Senate Democrats, and that's a consensus there. And then you have on the far left of the U.S. system, you have some people who aren't in that, and on the far right, you have some that aren't. But so all that to say is, it wasn't, something that anyone consciously chooses. They don't say, I don't like this guy. It's just a known thing that just comes together.
Can we then safely conclude that Biden was more institutional? He was under the influence of the foreign policy establishment, and the central intelligence, the intelligence community, the foreign policy establishment, the national security establishment that suddenly became more powerful after Trump's exit from the White House in January of 2021, didn't like Imran Khan. They thought Imran Khan was problematic, and this is how Biden never engaged Imran Khan. Can we make this conclusion?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so then what happened with Trump? Because before, in the run-up to the election in 2024, Pakistani military, I know, was extremely concerned, and they had a lot of trepidation as to how Donald Trump will react, and Richard Grenell and all that, and there was an expectation that Trump might actually make some statement to demand Imran Khan be released or be treated fairly, but then the military quickly engaged Donald Trump. How you look at the whole process?
Yeah, so I think everyone who studies Donald Trump or tries to influence him on any issue, whether you're on the hawkish neocon side or whether you're on the pro-diplomacy side, we all agree on one thing, which is that, he can be pretty arbitrary and, make decisions on a whim. I think I've joked that, we should make a truce with the neocons because we're both exhausted. In the morning, we're like, oh, he's talking about diplomacy. Then in the afternoon, he's saying, I'm going to, take out the leader. And then in the evening, he's saying, he's talking about a whole different country. I mean, so we're just exhausted, all of us. But all that to say is, so Rubio is well aware of this. Rubio essentially was tasked with pretending to be friendly to Trump so that the national security establishment would have a very effective voice inside the administration, and he's been really good at that. Which is something that, most of us are very frustrated with how good he is at it.
But what is your understanding? How the Pakistani military, found their entry with Donald Trump to begin with in January? Was that the CENTCOM helping them with Sharifullah was handed over to them as a master gate for Abbey Gate? Who really helped them to connect with Trump?
Yeah, I think my read of it would be that there isn't even such a clear divide between these entities. The military is so tied with the U.S., the Pakistani military establishment is so tied up with the U.S., that there's an ongoing coordination there. There's an ongoing discussion, and I think they very much see themselves on the same team. And that, that's not going to apply to people who are outside of that foreign policy consensus, but it obviously applies to people like Marco Rubio, Donald Liu, this Elizabeth Horst, anyone in those circles. They really see themselves as that is their goal. We have obviously some of these people in Congress, Tom Swazi, they're all on the side of the Pakistani government or regime, really. So in that sense, it wasn't difficult to come together. They essentially all have the same shared interest, and that's to have Trump make the right decision in their view, which is to prop up this regime so that it can continue to serve U.S. interest. And on the Pakistani side, I assume, they love power or money or something like that. Not exactly.
So, a few weeks ago for my own program, I was doing some research, on the net, and I saw that the research basically revealed to me, and I want you to comment on that Central Command, the CENTCOM, is more or less operationally integrated with the Pakistani military, whereas the Pacific Command doesn't have an operational coordination with the Indian military in the same way. So whereas when I was in Pakistan, I used to think that United States military is now moving and swinging towards the India. India is becoming the major player, but operationally the Indian military establishment is not connected. There are gaps of trust. They're not really part of the American military thinking, where Pakistan military is an extension of CENTCOM. Am I right?
Exactly. And this is such an important thing to understand about the way U.S. power works and the way that, what we would say is sort of a neo-colonialism works, right? There's obviously, the Pakistani military will say that in Pakistani, Pakistan in general will say, of course, they declared independence, but functionally, they're in sort of a neo-colonial relationship with the United States due to that, largely to that military relationship. And so, as you spend enough time in DC working on these issues, you realize that when the US says they are training a military, it's not like they go in and they just say, hey, here's some skills, good luck with that. They really integrate at that time. And they say that it's about integrating, platforms and, all these military terms that, I'm not an expert in all that.
Joint exercises.
It's about the command system, the weapon systems. It's about integrating all of that. And they do that with NATO as well. That's a big part of it, so they can have all the same weapon systems, same, command and control, all that type of stuff. So when there is, God forbid, a global war where they have to take down, Russia or China, you have proxies that can follow orders well. So that's what we really see. And so, that's often missed. People say, well, there's very limited training, or US isn't propping up Pakistan. It's so much more than that. There is a significant integration there.
Exactly. And integration is very important. That's why Pakistani military is very important to CENTCOM and also to the intelligence community, I guess. But Erik, your world is much bigger. I mean, you're not looking at Pakistan, you're just looking at the overall horizon. What kind of relationship United States has with India?
Yeah, well, that's very much in flux. I mean, the concept from the perspective of the national security establishment, as I'm sure you've covered in depth, was to use India to counterbalance China, of course. It's really one of the few ways that the U.S. could really hope to isolate China is to build a nucleus around India in that region. And then, the goal that even Biden talked about, again, he was totally senile on a number of things, but he really remembered foreign policy. And he remembered that the goal was to build this IMEC corridor, which is India, Middle East, Europe. And so the goal of that is to have essentially a massive economic corridor that also has political and military implications that could counter China's Belt and Road. And so that is a big part of why the U.S. needed Pakistan to not be so independent-minded. They needed it to kind of integrate and, kind of go under the Indian broader economic umbrella, kind of complement the Indian economy, rather than what Imran Khan was doing, which was striking deals with different powers based on different interests. Saudis, China, Russia, India, he was balancing it. But that wasn't going to get it done, because the goal is you want to create, from their perspective, they wanted to create an exclusive corridor that China's shut out of in order to have a chance of competing with China, which is a challenge as it is. So that's the concept.
But that's very interesting. You see, between 2000, first one, Pivot to Asia, that was launched and initiated by Obama administration. When you look at it, there was a desire that Pakistan and India should be close to each other. United States looked like they wanted to wean away Pakistan from the Chinese influence. Then the first Trump administration also had a strong position against the CPEC. They thought CPEC was an extension of Chinese influence towards West Asia in Pakistan and all that. And Imran Khan was reasonably hostile and not friendly towards India because of India's abrogation of the Article 370. He first tried to mend fences with India, but India did not respond to him. India saw Imran Khan as a proxy of the military establishment or as a continuation of the military establishment. They were not friendly towards him. Then came the Kashmir thing, the abrogation of Article 370, and things went south between Imran Khan and India. But at that time, I know from Foreign Office people in Pakistan that United States was breathing onto Pakistan to move away from China. And when this regime change happened in Pakistan, it was perceived that General Bajwa, the former army chief, the ex-army chief, who actually did the regime change, he wanted to improve relations between India and Pakistan. But now when we see things have totally moved in a different direction, this is a Pakistan that is confronting India from 2025 beginning, maybe for its own political reasons, and United States establishment is backing Pakistan, not backing India. So what is this transformation?
Yeah, well, I think, especially when someone like Imran Khan comes into power, and he's kind of running on essentially a national rejuvenation, kind of national, refounding of the nation kind of platform, that I would imagine the Indians have to, from their perspective, negotiate tough at first. Hopefully they can, because it's obviously very threatening. You're going to have a partner, a negotiating partner who's going to have really the people behind him. He's going to be a very skilled negotiator. He's obviously one of the more, one of the leaders in the world that has the most reach, both in the Muslim world and beyond. So he's a formidable, a force to be reckoned with. And so, from their perspective, just in the negotiations level, you could see why they would try to take a tough line initially. I think ultimately, if that were allowed to progress and the democratic mandate, were allowed to play out, it would settle down. They would find areas of mutual understanding. But that's exactly what the U.S. didn't want, where Pakistan would find mutual understanding with India on certain things and then work with the broader region, because that directly contradicts the idea of an exclusionary belt that kind of divides the world into two camps. And so that's what, China talks a lot about, the need to avoid dividing the world into camps. And that's informed by the experience of the Soviet Union that did have that campus approach, and it failed for a number of reasons. And so now we have a dynamic where, China's trying to say, no one has to choose sides. And the U.S. trying to say, yes, you do have to choose sides. And so it's puts a lot of developing countries.
Coming back to my question. So what happened to a United States establishment that wanted to wean away Pakistan from China, but now is comfortable with Pakistan being a strong Chinese ally and an American ally?
Yeah, I think they don't believe that it's a strong Chinese ally. They believe that that is.
But they don't. What are you talking about? I mean, this is earthquake. You think that the U.S. establishment doesn't think that Pakistan is a strong Chinese, credible Chinese ally?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think it's very similar to what the Saudis pulled. I think Pakistan was probably doing this before the Saudis actually did this. The Saudis mastered it, and now, which is essentially, you signal that you'll go to China if the U.S. puts any pressure on you. But of course, if anyone studies this closely, there's no Pakistani corrupt generals retiring in Shanghai. They buy their property in the West. They're culturally tied to the West, and so I think
the children come to the American universities or British universities for studies.
Yeah, I mean, if someone can, I'm not an expert in the practices of the Pakistani elite and their children, but if someone can inform me if they're going to China, I'd be shocked. I think this is more of a tactic that we've seen used. I think it's a very convenient tactic, both for Pakistan and their supporters here, because the number one argument you'll hear in Washington is we have to support Pakistan's human rights violations, because if we don't, then China will support their human rights violations. And so that's their number one argument. When you've defeated them in every other argument, and they're educated about the human rights violations, they'll say, well, it's going to happen either way, so we might as well support their human rights violations. And I would say that's immoral. No, you don't want to be the one anyway. But that's another topic.
But let me bring a more twisting and puzzle into the whole thing. Pakistan developed started to develop a very strong, intimate relationship with China from 1960s, when it became the first non-communist country to fly to China. It opened China to the world. China's postal department was being at one point handled by Pakistan when China was alienated. And then Pakistan facilitated China's entry into the Western club by smuggling Henry Kissinger into Beijing. Then the Kissinger and Nixon meetings with the Chinese leadership, Mao Zedong, was all facilitated by Pakistan. Somehow or the other, it has been insufficiently acknowledged by the Western academia, but it was all happening. But the Pakistani theory was this, that since we have opened China to the West, we can keep on playing a balancing role between China and United States. That worked very well till you can say till 9/11 and all that, the United States never seriously objected to Pakistan playing on both sides. And it was accepted that Pakistan, after China's entry into World Trade Organization and suddenly the unexpected rise of the Chinese, economic muscle and the fears that this economic muscle is going to feed onto the military muscle. And then with the pivot to Asia, United States started thinking that Pakistan should be taken away, China has to be contained, Pakistan and India have to be friendly. So this continued till, you can say, till 2022, this thinking. Suddenly, with this background I'm explaining, suddenly there is a new change. Suddenly it looks like that United States is now more aligned with Pakistan, less aligned with India, is less bothered by Pakistan being on the Chinese side as well. This is what my puzzle is. I mean, if you comment something on it.
Yeah, I mean, it is an incredibly complex situation, especially in Washington. Typically, if a party is engaging with China, typically that would be grounds for, there to be a lot of criticism of that country in Washington. But I do think in these types of situations where the U.S. wants to support a human rights violating regime, it's particularly useful. Definitely with the Saudis, you see it with Vietnam, you see it with Pakistan. And there's many other examples. I could think of more. But in particular in those cases, it's very useful for the U.S. establishment for that reason I said, because I think it does give them that excuse to say that we don't control the cards. In general, with these neo-colonial relationships, there's really an intent to in the U.S. side to emphasize the sovereignty of the country. So I remember this when Hillary Clinton, who's supported all types of interventions, has never respected sovereignty of other countries. Then when he was asked about her support for Saudi Arabia, she said, well, it's a sovereign country. They have their own customs. So they respect sovereignty once it's a U.S., human rights violating U.S. ally. But if it's, any opponent, then of course, we can micromanage their affairs. So
these are very flexible terms. These are very fungible, flexible.
Yeah. So in this case, I think it also bolsters their ability to say, Pakistan is sovereign. We don't control them. When in reality, of course, we know that if it wasn't for the U.S. support, there'd be no possible way for the Pakistani economy to function. That would be over because of the the Western financial institution support. China hasn't offered that and wouldn't offer that. And then of course the military.
China has no international mechanism matching the Western institutions. I mean, Pakistan is being fed and kept alive by IMF, by World Bank, by Asian Development Bank, by the GSP Plus entry into Europe, by the UK aid, and by so many other European countries, by the Japanese investing into development projects. The Pakistani regime is totally dependent upon the financial and strategic architecture that is actually influenced by United States. But let's moving forward a little bit. You use the term new colonial relationship. Why United States could never develop that new colonial relationship with India?
India has such a unique history. I mean, I think they did truly develop, true sovereignty, and I think, that sovereignty has been demonstrated by, the way that they, can push back against the U.S. I think they're just a different dynamic to the way that their, national liberation struggle and social movements develop that I don't, we haven't quite seen in Pakistan as far as I can tell. And there's probably, I'm not an expert in the historical factors that made India result that way, but, I think it's pretty clear that they are in fact a sovereign country, even though they do a lot of harmful things. And that sovereignty, means ultimately that, they do take an independent path. I mean, even when, they're able to engage with Russia in a way that the U.S. absolutely hates, and it does but they defend that relationship. And so, I think it definitely shows that true sovereignty makes the difference. I think the U.S., national security community knew that Imran Khan was absolutely a rock solid guarantee of that true sovereignty. Regardless of if people have critiques of him, you hear, no matter what, the country was going to be sovereign under him, and that's exactly what the U.S. would prefer to have not happen if they can control it.
Yeah. But the sovereign India is having a very difficult relationship with Donald Trump, with the United States at the moment. They're not budging on Russia. They're not even prepared to do or to take a kind of stand against China, which the Western establishments would like them to do. How do you assess this relationship at the moment, the difficult relationship between India and the United States?
Well, I think it's thrown into chaos because of Trump. Trump is such a unique person. He's not trained in the U.S. grand strategy, like any of the other presidents were, including Biden, or even like Rubio is. He has his own. He's looking for transactional deals, and that clashes when you do have, I mean, in this case, a right-wing nationalist in Modi. There's a clash there. They're not willing to. As we obviously saw, that the military, effectively military dictator Asim Munir came. He's showing Trump, here are minerals, you can have these, and just saying, what can we do to placate you, and it's, we saw obviously, I know some, we never seen anyone, suck up to somebody. I even learned a new Pakistani phrase related to, well, it's kind of a,
What is
offensive
that
phrase, but
phrase?
oh God, it's the one about lifting, yeah, that one. But they removed the statue, I believe, because it was but that's obviously
So you,
Shabazz Sharif.
so you have
He
learned
broke.
this. You have learned this phrase.
I remember the statue, I think, had to be removed because it reminded people too much of politicians serving the military establishment, most likely. But Shabazz Sharif broke world records with his praise of Donald Trump. I mean, it's just the most, it really just is, would be beneath almost any self-respecting person. But he mastered it and he pulled it off. He really seemed like he
But
believed
some
it.
some Pakistanis think that the General Asim Munir has been very smart in recommending Donald Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize. And Pakistan was the first country. Even Israel couldn't really think of it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm sure they didn't think of it themselves. I mean, Trump, Rubio told them. I'm assuming, and again, it's I think for most people around the world before this week, I think many of us thought there's no way that he could be. We think he wants it, right? He wants the Nobel Prize, but nobody truly understood his really borderline. It's a pretty troubling obsession,
So
to
you're
say the
saying
least.
that you think that the Pakistanis in June of 2025 were able to nominate Donald Trump for Nobel Prize because someone insider, very close to Donald Trump, fully understood that how Donald Trump has the strong emotional need. Donald Trump must have been speaking about it, and Pakistan became the first country. So who do you think is the most influential Washington insider that is helping them? They have about 6 lobbyists. They're paying about $7 to $8 million a year for them. But who is the most influential connection between Pindi and Washington at the moment?
Rubio. It's clearly Rubio. I mean, you just have to look at we just have to know where his mindset, look at his statements, and then you could look at the photos taken in the Oval Office. I mean, you could tell he was giddy with how well the meeting went because this is his plan, and you just don't know how it's going to go until you get Trump in the room, and you hope it goes well. And that's
We,
Rubio's entire
I thought it
job.
would be Steve Witkoff. Why Rubio?
Well, Witkoff is, they seem to have some now a growing business connection, and that's important, right? But the way the current arrangement works with Donald Trump, okay, is that because you don't know what he's going to say in the
Hmm,
moment, and he has a
hmm,
lot of
hmm,
unconventional views that
hmm,
can
hmm,
change any time,
hmm,
people like Rubio don't take an issue to him until
hmm,
they've already coordinated with everyone they can who's going to be in the room. So
hmm.
when Trump says, "Oh, what do you think?" Okay, Marco, thanks for that. What do you think, Steve Witkoff? And Witkoff says, "Well, I agree with Marco." And then so they try to control it because if Rick Grinnell's in that room, he might say, "Well, I think we should probably just call for Imran Khan to be freed, sir." And then Trump might say, I would do that. That sounds pretty good. So that's how, and this is known if you've ever been a staffer, as I've been a congressional staffer. It's the same in the House side as it
Hmm,
is
hmm, hmm.
in the executive branch. You don't just go to your boss and just say, "Hey, what do you think?" You have to coordinate and prepare, and you
Right.
can do that in a good faith way, or
Yeah.
you can do that in a manipulative way.
So you
And
push the ideas. It's a psychology of power. How do you speak to power? It's a psychology of selling an idea to the power, right? So how do you facilitate an idea and you bring it in front of the decision maker, the powerful decision maker, so that he thinks that this is his own idea. He can own the idea. Is this what you're suggesting, right?
Yeah, essentially. But especially in Donald Trump's case, you need to control who's in the room because you don't want, an unconventional view to be in the room. And that's happened a lot, even with JD Vance, who's disappointed a lot of anti-war people because he was on the anti-war side of the right. And now he's sort of shifted and not stayed as true to that. But, having him in the room has already had an impact. We saw in the first in the Yemen war, right at the start of the administration, Rubio was in the I'm sorry, Vance was in the texts criticizing, saying we should stay out of Yemen. And he was the voice saying that. Um, so yeah, it is that, especially in an administration like this, it's more important than ever, where the president is not in a particular school of thought and can go either way.
Correct me if I'm wrong. My feeling is just when I reflect and think of the kind of team the first Bush had, the Bush senior had, then the Bush junior had, the Clinton had, the Obama had. I think as if this present team, apart from the Marco Rubio, is not bringing any experience of U.S. foreign policy, U.S. power dynamics, its history, the history of the Western alliance, the relationship between Europe and the United States on the table.
Yeah, it's pretty limited. I mean, at least at the highest levels. But that's where Rubio has maneuvered very well, because he's not only Secretary of State, he's also the National Security Advisor, which I believe the last person to do that was Kissinger. And so that's been very, very, very smart on his part to manage that. So he does a lot. He can carry, he has a lot of weight, and he's done incredibly well at that. But you're right that there are a mix of people. In general, I would say, given the failure of U.S. foreign policy, we'd rather have a mix of people, because the conventional wisdom has been a disaster for not just for the people of the world, obviously, primarily, but also for us, where we don't have investments
So
in
why
strategic
why you
sectors.
had why you had zoomed onto Marco Rubio in the previous part of the conversation? Why you immediately zoomed onto Marco Rubio? The Marco Rubio is the main connection between Pindi and Washington.
Because he's the main person in the room. All the reporting says that it's a very small circle around him, around Trump, and Rubio is in Trump's good graces totally. And so when you look at the characters in the administration, you look at you look at his statements on Pakistan, and you look at what his State Department's doing. You look at that he's kept on people from the previous administration. Rubio represents continuity in the U.S.-Pakistan policy. And it's not just that, Rubio, it's not just that he's bad on this issue. He's essentially wrong on every single issue in the very strategic way. Like, when you're in his school of thought, they know the correct position from their point of view on every single issue. And so in Pakistan, it's clear as day. There's total consensus in the national security elite sectors. Pakistan's a strategic ally. We got to do everything we can to prevent, someone from rising there who's going to challenge our strategic vision, especially at a time like this, where China, just to get back to your point of no challenge, China, it dwarfs the Soviet Union in every single category. It dwarfs it. And then they're aligned in an unprecedented alliance with Russia. So the threat posed by China and Russia and that alliance it dwarfs anything that the Soviet Union ever could do at its peak. So that's why
because Soviet Union was never an economic power in the true sense of it.
No, and it was and it just didn't have the right vision. That's what China learned from those things. And China now has posed a threat to the U.S. Is scrambling to figure out what to do about it. And that's particularly why there's even less flexibility now around issues like Pakistan, because they see it all as zero sum, race at this point. We need to eliminate as many of China's allies as possible and build a counter-China bloc as quickly as possible. That's how they see it.
So from this, we can assume that the ultimate strategic goal of the U.S. establishment will be still to establish such a relationship with Pakistan that it helps them to wean Pakistan away from China. That has to be a goal. Am I?
I think they're fine with that. I mean, I think they're fine with the current arrangement. They would like to, resume selling weapons to Pakistan. And they've started to do that. They just recently announced a package to upgrade some of Pakistan's old U.S. purchased jets,
F-16
fighter jets. And so they're trying to inch back towards resuming those types of sales and military support, because I think they are, again, they are concerned with the interoperability. That's the word I was looking for. The interoperability.
Exactly. I was looking for the same word, interoperability. Yes, this is what they have this developed. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, there is a risk to that if they keep buying too much Chinese hardware. And so that's why both sides, I mean, going back to the old ambassador, he said years ago, that's their focus. And so, but they understand their political constraints because for whatever reason in the conservative mind in the U.S. and partly because of the history and CIA-backed Mujahideen, and there's still a negative perception of Pakistan that isn't really that warranted. I mean, in reality, it's been quite a pliant U.S. state.
Hmm.
So,
Hmm.
but that's still a perception. So that's what they're. But I think. But yeah, that's the idea. I mean, in Imran Khan, from their perspective, and I think it's probably correct. If Imran Khan comes into power, he's not only the most powerful voice for for Palestine, for Muslims, and for developing world countries. He's not only the most powerful person there, but they're also worried about what would happen if he essentially, indirectly or informally kind of joined that Russia, China, Iran bloc. It's such a big bloc, a huge population there. From their perspective, that's like very close to the end, where China would have so many strong allies in their region.
But Eric, let's put it this way. You have mentioned that Imran is charismatic, he's very intelligent, he connects with the people, he represents the people. But if I say, if you were Imran Khan's advisor when he was the prime minister between 2018 and 2022, right? And you look at the world, and someone with you are the advisor of Imran Khan, but you take all your understanding of the American power system and the Western alliance and all what's the power switchboard between United States, Russia, China, Middle East, and everything. Would you advise Imran Khan to follow the same kind of strong, extremely strong, robust nationalistic position, or would you or advise Imran Khan to sort of budge and adjust with the Western power? What would you advise him then?
Well, it's a lot easier with hindsight, I would say. And I can't speak to what extent, his, strong foreign policy positions were, showed the population that, he was different from the past. I don't know to what percentage of his support was due to that. So it's hard to speak to exactly that. But, I think if we, if he knew now what he knew then, I suspect he'd be able to make changes too, such as to better prepare for the type of organizing that the U.S. and their establishment in Pakistan could do against him, even when he was being conciliatory. He probably would have been able to know that. But, I think he was it's a challenging position, I imagine, because you're going up against the domestic, military, the establishment, and you're also thrown into an economic crisis right off the bat. That's incredibly challenging for him to get out of. So yeah, I don't envy. He was not in an enviable position. I think it's probably easy to
Hmm.
look back, but it
Hmm.
was almost impossible. He was in an impossible situation,
He
and I
wasn't.
think,
I agree. He was in a
yeah,
very difficult situation, and the every political leader ultimately draws his intelligence and understanding from what the country's intelligentsia also understands. So I think the Pakistani middle classes and intelligentsia also did not understand that relationship very well. And Imran Khan always thought that if he was comfortable with the British celebrity and elite as a celebrity, as a cricketer, he would also be comfortable with the Western political elite in the same way. And that was a wrong assessment. So he did not understand the once again I'm groping for the right word, the matrix of the Western power, that how the Western institutions control the new colonial states. And Pakistan was not sovereign like India, and Pakistan was a sort of a very weak new colonial state in which the Western institutions had very deep penetration. But coming back to the Marco Rubio, before I want to go back to the Pakistani community and what they have done in the past 3.5 years, there's a very intelligent thing the Pakistani military then did. You said Marco Rubio is still the national security advisor, a position which no one has held since Henry Kissinger in the 1970s. But Pakistani Army Chief General Asim Munir brought his DGISI, which the Inter-Services Intelligence Head, intelligence spy, who is his main man and linchpin of everything, as National Security Advisor in April 2025. That means they must have been given this understanding from someone inside Washington. Then Marco Rubio will become the biggest player. So Marco Rubio is NSA, and Pakistan's DGISI is also the NSA. So Pakistani military has connected Marco Rubio with DGISI General Asim Malik. So they have now developed a very smooth vehicle and communication in Washington, as per your as how you describe it.
exactly. And,
Very
and
smart.
Rubio, he's not just a hawkish senator, but he was one of the top Republicans on the Senate Intel Committee for many, many years. He's one of the more active members on that committee. So when you're in the Senate Intel Committee at the highest levels, you're essentially an extension. They're supposed to be doing oversight For those who study the American, political system, the concept is you're supposed to be doing oversight of the intelligence community. You're supposed to be constraining their power. You're in the legislative branch. They're in the executive branch. You're supposed to be constraining, checking, make sure they're not abusing their power, but that's not how it works, unfortunately. And so essentially when, in our current state of affairs, in that role at Senate Intel, he's essentially an extension of the intelligence community. So all that to say is, you essentially have someone who's, he just has the perfect experience to do this job. And, the only thing that can stop him, I would say, is, Donald Trump, if Donald Trump has a whim in some direction, or if the Pakistani people turn up the pressure, or if the American people turn up the pressure, or a mixture of that, and so that's, I think, what we're working on, and what we're building towards, actually.
Yeah, I want to come to it. I mean, you have worked with the Pakistani community, with different kind of Pakistani community groups, What do you think the Pakistani community achieved and where it failed?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say anything has failed yet. I mean, what's been achieved is obviously the most unprecedented human rights activism in the history of the U.S.-Pakistan relationship. I mean, there's no question about that. Obviously, what we've done in the last 3 years has been more than the rest of the all of the activism prior to that combined. So that's pretty good. Okay, so that's pretty impressive. We're obviously seeing a community that is getting more comfortable in the country, that's getting more wealthy. It's a very incredibly successful community. And so they're stepping into their political power more and more. I think there's a learning process that's going on, and we're definitely seeing people learn. I think, I noticed the community at the start, they said, well, if we just explain, Imran Khan's story, they're going to see it. And it's a very human thing to think, which is exactly the same mistake Imran Khan may have made, which is people should be able to see that this is a reasonable, decent fight here. And then unfortunately, the system is more complex than that. And so I think that's the process that it's currently in now is, because the U.S. establishment, they don't consider themselves to be wielding power in an abusive way. They consider themselves to be good people who are trying to promote freedom. We make mistakes, but we want our side to win because the other side is evil and we're good. So that's how they think of themselves. So when the community comes and says, my family was targeted, those people say, wow, this is horrible. I need to do something. But then they work their way up the different levels, and the more sophisticated people in the Foreign Affairs Committee or in the administration will say, okay, but we have interests there. Okay, we need to balance this. We don't want to rupture the relationship, and that's where they will say, or they'll go to China. So that's where that becomes very useful. So that's the process we're in right now.
I have one objection. I mean, how can people justify what happened to Venezuela? I mean, U.S. forces barging in, abducting Nicolas Maduro, from the presidential office and his wife, and beat them shit out of them and bring them in New York court. I mean, how can they convince themselves we're doing any good?
Well, that one's pretty easy. They just say, well, he was undemocratic, and he's a human rights violator, and that's why we removed him. And but the part that's more problematic is why they don't say that about any of the U.S. client states. That's the part
in Saudi Arabia, in Pakistan, Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, I mean, Iran, you just had protests. You wouldn't know it from U.S. media, but Saudi Arabia doesn't allow one person to go protest for any amount of time. So, but you'd never hear that. Everyone said the brutal Iranian regime. It's like, it does sound brutal, but it's not anywhere in the same universe as the Saudis or the UAE or Egypt. So, and those they all get our weapons, where Iran certainly doesn't get any U.S. weapons. So that's how they justify it.
Yeah, but I kind of understand, but many of my viewers will be troubled because this hypocrisy is so visible. I mean, Iran, look at the massacre. You'll remember. You remember that how the Pakistani military fired upon the peaceful sleeping protesters after around midnight on 26th November 2024, and New York Times and the American mainstream legacy media like New York Times, Washington Post did not even cover it, CNN, CNBC, MSN, no one has covered it. Look, there was a news story on Iran after every 5 hours or 4 hours. And look at the kind of astounding figures. 6,000 people are dead, 12,000 people fear dead, 20,000 people fear dead. Where are they bringing these figures from?
Yeah, well, it speaks to, the systemic kind of the design of the system and the way it's set up. Folks may have read, this book by Noam Chomsky. You could just read a summary of it, which is Manufacturing Consent. and it's how the U.S. How the U.S. system, without state control of the media, how it produces actually a more effective result than state media. And the way it works is essentially, if no one in the think tanks, I mean, I think everyone in this community knows how many think tankers are there focused on Pakistan. There's less than 5 that we know of. It's really 1 or 2, and, and they share the broader region. So there's nobody, if these journalists aren't hearing from think tankers who are talking about human rights, they're not hearing from the intelligence community sources, they're not hearing from Congress members, then they're just not going to cover it. It's not in their world. It's not something they're connected to. And so that's where the work the community's been doing, and we've been working to strengthen this work, is to force that hypocrisy into the conversation. Because when you do force it into the conversation, it's basically impossible for them to deny it, because you'll see that they will never say, sorry, I don't care about your family. If they're, I don't care about your family. Like, your family's going to suffer because we need to control Pakistan. They'll never say that. So you have to essentially force it into the conversation, and that's what the community's been doing. But for each time
given the structure of the US media, how do we make Pakistan part of the conversation? I mean, you've been doing a good job. Katie Halper has been doing a good job. Marion Offal has been doing a good job. Brian Grimm has been doing a good job. But still, the enormity. I mean, Pakistan is the 5th largest nation state in the world, the 2nd largest Muslim country, with the largest, the best possible military institution anywhere in the Muslim world. But it's not part of the conversation. That's what's happening in Pakistan. The human right, the rule of law, the courts, the system. It's not part of the conversation.
Exactly. And that's a kind of a related but separate field that we should, anyone who's interested, we should look at that, because you've obviously done a great job in speaking to a largely, Pakistani and Pakistani American audience, but we do need to break through, so that it gets the fair coverage it deserves as the 5th largest country in the world. I mean, it's unbelievable how little coverage it gets. And, but I think there are, specific mechanisms that can be used, Unfortunately, the community, again, doesn't have high-paid lobbyists. We've tried with the support, we've limited support we've gotten, to do everything we can, and I think we do pretty well countering, the regime's high-paid lobbying team. But we could use more support in general. But I think that's the type of strategic interventions during the protests that resulted in the massacre. We were trying to figure out how to break through. The regime at that time. The Tarar, I forget his role, but he was doing multiple press conferences every day in English. That's one good thing.
Who was multiple doing press conferences every day?
What's the minister's last name? Tarar, T-A.
Ataullah Tarar.
Yeah, thank you.
Tarar,
yeah. So he was doing English language press conferences, and so I know there's a lot of excitement, for good reason, in the growing mobilizations in Pakistan right now. I think it would be good to talk about in advance, the kind of media strategy, because once you can get that international buy-in, it creates a momentum of its own that can then feed the protest, and the protests feed the media. And so I think, but it's not going to happen on its own. In this case, we have to, people who care about exposing the human rights situation to the world, we need to work strategically to have those interventions. And that's certainly something that we want to work on, but it does take some people on the ground as well to kind of share in that.
Definitely. So coming to this Pakistani community thing, the HR 901 in June of 2024 was the highest point where, the community was able to mobilize. What do you think about the House Resolution 901? How do you think it came about? I mean, this kind of bipartisan consensus on Pakistan's human right, democracy, how it came about?
Yeah, well, as you recall, the first initiative was Res 901, which was a non-binding resolution that, expressed some concerns. It kind of said things on both sides. And then ultimately, members of the community last minute, when that was going for a vote, well, we'll just back up quickly. The community had built a lot of power by that time and started to get more engaged. We were able to strengthen that 901 in committee. And then we were able to...
I didn't understand. And the last moment, what the community did? Packed up what?
Yeah, so there was 2 things. Number one, the community basically gained experience and strength in a way that made Res 901 appear weaker. It was too weak for where the community was at that time. And so then there was pressure to strengthen.
It was too weak. I mean, explain this. I mean, you said
this was the first one.
901 looked good, but it was very weak, structurally weak. Why was it weak?
Well, when it was initially done, it was it was before the community had flexed any power at all. And so there was some stuff, some lines in there that were talked about human rights and democracy, but the language was very mild, because the prevailing understanding was, well, we need to balance our relationship with Pakistan. But by the time that bill got to the Foreign Affairs Committee to be considered, the community had strengthened, and we were able to work to get stronger language in there. And then, which was specifically said that the elections, essentially needed, that essentially said that the elections were problematic and needed to be, scrutinized, and essentially said the elections were basically not legitimate, is what it essentially said. And then we got a floor vote. So that was the high point, in the community's history and in the relationship of getting a floor vote on Pakistan human rights and democracy. So that was unprecedented. And then we had many other letters that increasingly were drawing attention to Asim Munir and the military role and calling for sanctions on him, not sanctions on the country, but just sanctions on his corruptly gained, assets, and on other human rights violating officials. And so then that was where we're moving, right? To say, you need to allow democracy.
But the feeling is this is somehow the whole thing is stuck. I mean, the kind of movement that was taking shape in Congress hasn't really progressed.
Yep, and this is a very clear reason. Once your movement, I've experienced this many times, and I could go through case studies, for those interested. But once your movement starts to flex its muscles, they no longer say, the people who are in power will no longer try to ignore you, because you actually have already, built the power to force your issue onto the agenda. So then they have to deal with it. So then what they do, and what we've seen recently, is they will try to take the issue. So we know we have very many independent-minded members of Congress who support us and who will do what the community wants. And when I say us, I mean, those Americans who don't want the U.S. to be propping up a military regime, and those Pakistani Americans who are also fighting for their own freedom and that of their families. That's kind of the coalition is between, those two groups. And so that's what we've seen with the newest bill, which, I think is a very, has a nice name, has some nice language. But when you look at this new bill,
you're referring to the HR 5271.
5271, and it's led by House Foreign Affairs Committee, the relevant Pakistan subcommittee, the chair and top Democrat of that committee. And when you look at it, it all looks very strong. But then when you really read the text, ultimately all it asks for and requires is a classified report. So it says the president may impose sanctions. But that's already an existing law. Of course, he may. What we need is legislation that says the president must. That's what the legislation needs to say at this point. And so what the current strategy is, and they won't love that I'm sharing this, House Foreign Affairs, but their strategy is have a bill that looks strong but doesn't actually do anything. Then tell the community, work really hard. If you get enough support for this bill.
Whose strategy is this? You think the congressmen and the congressional teams have this strategy?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly the strategy. And it's not necessarily, for some of them it's conscious, for some of them it's just them weighing the different pressures. These people have been told, and it's not even something they need to be told, but they know we don't want to put too much pressure on the Pakistani regime. They're a close ally. We want to balance the concerns of our constituents with our importance of that relationship. And so that's where this comes from. It's not consciously evil necessarily. It may be, but it doesn't have to be.
No, I agree with you. So it's a power dynamics. It's a psychological dynamics of the power. Once the president after January increasingly likes the Pakistani military, appreciates that. So the Republican congressmen and the senators get a cue as to what the president is thinking. So if the executive is having a romance and a what do you call a honeymoon with the Pakistani military establishment, how can Congress be taking a very strong position? So every congressional aide understand that. And also, when you say that when a community becomes important, then it has to be looked and scrutinized more carefully. So once by the House Resolution 901, the Pakistani military understood that Pakistani community is all doing. They started making their own inroads into the Pakistani community. They started engaging them. They started having conferences and seminars and started pushing funds and money. So they have sort of split and penetrated the community. So how to go forward then?
Yeah, so I think the key is, is ideally continuing to integrate these experiences, see what's worked and what hasn't. The basic thing is you want to build power. What I've noticed about the community is there's been a big focus on, let's do this activity and this event and this bill and then let's publicize it and the regime will get really scared. Unfortunately, the regime has lobbyists, and those lobbyists will simply say, don't worry, that's not going to harm you. Like, that's just, these guys are doing something, a symbolic thing. But what does scare them is when we're going at it in a sophisticated way, which is essentially really learning the tricks in Congress. And we have a very clear path here, which is number one, we need to demand a vote on HR 5271 immediately. It's non-controversial. It's just a classified report. There's nothing that should delay that. It has 50 co-sponsors. This thing should be voted on immediately. It should pass like unanimously. Okay. But then as we're in that process, we should look to amend it like we did with 901, include some language that has teeth. So the community is going to have to transition. We've had a lot of people being very kind to the community. We love to see that. People talking to their constituents, showing care for them on a personal level. But we're at a stage where we need members of Congress to support legislation that has teeth. That's really where we're at. We cannot have any more symbolic.
But teeth would be difficult, right? If the congressmen understand the executive's position, maybe symbolic things can still keep the spirit alive. I mean, how can the executive will allow teeth in a legislation piece or act which is against their best strategic interest in South Asia?
Yeah, it's not that coordinated. Like Marco Rubio can manage the president somewhat, but he's not that skilled to be able to go into every member of Congress and tell them, ignore your constituents. Yeah, I know their family's being picked up, but disregard them. That's not really within the capability of the U.S. government to do that. And so that's where the strategy comes in, is when the constituents are going to their member, they're saying, please, you have a heartfelt, genuine plea to support. And then you say, we've tried symbolic stuff. We need you to support binding measures. All we're asking you to do is to support sanctions that you've put on every other leader in the world. Right. And we're asking for the same treatment because we're humans as well. So that's the general concept of it. And that's where we're going. And then, if Trump's president and Democrats come in to the House, it'll be easier to pass those kind of things. Just like if it was when Biden was president, it's a little easier to get Republicans to take action. So this is the type of approach, but it's continuing to escalate the pressure because we know that this regime, their goal, and they're dreaming and hoping that this will go away. It will go back to normal and they get to shift back and forth between the corrupt parties again. That's what they're praying for. And so as long as the community here, we keep that pressure on, it's just a matter of time because the economic and political system is so, it has no sustainability to that system.
Okay, just last set of questions,
Yes.
There's a term called low-hanging fruit. Can we identify the low-hanging fruit? For instance, transnational repression. I mean, who in US Congress will oppose when there is a strong mayor that, there should not be any permission? Because what the Pakistani military is doing is taking pictures of the people who protest or they look at the tweets. They find them from their electronic database of Nadra. They then hunt down their relatives. They abduct their fathers, cousins, uncles. There has to be a strong position on that in the form of a bill and an act. No one from Republican or Democratic side is going to oppose that, no transnational repression is acceptable. I mean, this can be very strong bipartisan move, or for something for the media, something for the censorship of the Google and the Twitter. They can come up with a strong hand, strong foot on Twitter, X, YouTube, and all other American corporations and saying Google that, hey, you can't really be taking dictation from the Pakistani government. You're American corporations. You're responsible here. Their interests are. So these kind of low-hanging fruits we can push.
Exactly. And the community has, because we've had some of our best activists who've been targeted, by the regime, but been received summons or what have you at their families' houses back home. And those have generated strong responses from members of Congress, and I think that's one very effective way. As the regime gets more desperate, it's going to take more desperate measures. And then as it takes those desperate measures, we highlight those. And then increasingly it creates, a spiral that the goal is that spiral, then you see protests, right? So we have protests back in Pakistan. We work to get international media attention. Then members of Congress speak out. So this is the type of virtuous cycle that we want to create that will ultimately, lead this regime to call quits and let sovereignty and democracy take hold. But it's just going to take. The key thing that I think the number one thing to understand, I say, is that it's about, Imran Khan himself understands this. It's about saying, I'll fight as long as it takes. It's the worst thing anyone can do is look desperate. If you look desperate, that tells them we can wait them out. They're getting tired. They're fancy doctors and engineers in DC or in the United States. They're living a good life. They're going to get tired. Let's wait them out. And if you just say, we're never going to get tired. We're going to go steady until we win, and we're only going to get stronger. That is what's going to start to make them realize there's no escape here, and they might as well cut a deal now, exit while they still can. And so I've just urged people to, it's one of those counterintuitive things where the more you signal that you'll fight till the end, the quicker you'll win, actually.
Erik, thank you so much. It has been a fascinating discussion. Very interesting. I really enjoyed it, and I look forward to very interesting feedback from the people as well, and look forward to stay in touch with you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.